Hi, my name is Mona Jamshed, and I'm going to introduce you to a series of lectures on a software engineering course called Requirements Engineering. I delivered this course to a group of students of Bachelors of Software Engineering at University of Adelaide in the year 2022. This course covers the foundation of requirements specification of a software product. I had the course in different sections, and it started from understanding requirements specification, understanding the client's needs, analyzing those needs, testing and validation of those needs, prototyping, and management. The slides that I have used have originally been prepared by Professor Dagmar Monnet, who is a professor of computer sciences at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. She has very kindly provided these slides for teaching purposes and has also allowed the modification. So a slight modification has been done to suit the needs of the students. I've tried to teach this course in a very basic manner using everyday examples. I hope you enjoy this series and you're able to learn something about requirements engineering. Also, you will be seeing this clip at the beginning of each of the lectures that I'll be uploading under this lecture series. Happy studying. All right, all good. So, okay, guys, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's seminar session. And in this one, we are going to cover requirement analysis. So it was really, in a way, good listening to Anthony and Peter today, because I think most of you got introduced to this new terminology that Anthony and Peter's paper was based on, the ARS. They talked about taking care of all the functional, non-functional attributes, and the analysis. I'm going to talk and highlight the importance of taking care of all these attributes while you are doing the analysis of the requirements. So just a brief look out of what we have been doing like in the past 2 weeks. Our main focus has been mainly on requirement elicitation, and we covered that. We finished that last session, and we have covered many elicitation techniques. We have talked about the interviews, workshops, questionnaires, focus groups, user interface analyses, and we talked about some of the protocols that are required to conduct an effective elicitation session. So how to conduct a good interview, how to have a good workshop, what are the things you have to take care of, and all that. There were some key actions in elicitation where we said we need to take care of, first of all, identify who the users are, and then get to know their needs, their goals. And then we talk about the environment that they want that application to be set up. And then you move on to the data collection, where you basically talk about, you try to understand the logic behind, and you try to gather the insight from the users. So we also talked about the elicitation activities. So all this has been covered in detail in the last session. For those who haven't covered last session or weren't present, so I'm just letting you know. So activity for a single, like if you're conducting an interview, for example, so what are the things you have to do apart from preparing your questions? What resources you need to prepare in advance? How are you going to perform that session? And then how you're going to do the follow-up, how you're going to organize your notes. And if there are any open issues, you're going to document them, get back to your client and get them clarified. And we also touched upon some of the cautions we need to take. We talked about balance, where we make sure that we let all the speakers have a fair chance of speaking up and presenting their requirements, and some of the good practices. So now, I think after like having 2 weeks of elicitation sessions, we have covered in depth, and we now move on to the next stage, which is the requirement analysis. Again, I'd like to, here's the acknowledgement. The slides that I'm using here have been very kindly provided by Professor Dagmar. who have been using these slides for her course at Berlin School of Economics. And yeah, so we are using the same here. I'm going to begin this analysis seminar with this comic. And I think it's always good to start with a comic, right? So it says here, basically the gist of this comic is that you may be working quite hard to sort of gather all the requirements, make them as lengthy and as clear as possible. But then another challenge is actually to make the user read the requirements. And this comic is basically a reflection of the real world, actually. So, you know, here you are making sure that your elicitation sessions is during your elicitation sessions, you're able to gather as specific requirement as possible and write as much as possible. But then you also have to figure out how you're going to make the clients read the requirement. So I think it's a good comic to start with, because it gives you a head off as to how things happen in the real world. Moving on, so where does the analysis stand in the requirement development process framework? So we have mainly talked about the requirements in the previous set of slides, and we now come at a stage where we want to classify that information, right? We want to categorize them and give more meaning to them. So what you have to do is make sure, I think one thing that is not quite understandable is that this whole process is iterative. Nothing happens in one straight line. You can't say that you have finished your elicitation and now you're moving on to analysis. You can always go back, and you must go back to seek any clarifications, even in the analysis part. So everything remains open and goes on in the RD process framework. So basically, in analysis, what we are doing is we are starting to make things more formal, right? We are now trying to make sense of those requirements by giving them more meaning, and we're trying to make them more understandable, so that when we are move it on to the developers, they are able to make some sense and start working on the development. So you know, the job of the analyst would be to make sense of all those expressions, terminologies that users have been using, and so that we can, you know, pass it on to our developers. So yeah, we go on to the analysis. Basically, it's about documenting your requirements, breaking your requirements into smaller chunks, and evaluating them, giving them more meaning. And so these are some of the things that we are going to discuss further in the slides. All right. So in the last slide, like in the last lecture, during the elicitation, we talked about organizing and classifying the requirements into various categories. And like we talked about the business requirement, user requirement, functional, non-functional, solution ideas, and if there are any constraints. So all this you're trying to, from the huge requirement data that you have collected, you're trying to now put them in the right category. And even now in your the project course that the project that you're going to do as part of this course, tomorrow, as you know, in the workshop, we are going to have this first client meeting. So eventually you will also see that you will be doing this phase of analysis as well of the requirements. And for the sake of this course, maybe we have tried to make things easy for you, but then let me assure you that in the real world, it's much different. It's you really have to have good skills and experience. So for example, the user, I mentioned this before as well, your client may be really good at identifying the functional attributes, that how he wants his system to function, the functionalities of that application or the system that you're making, but they may not focus more so on the quality attributes. So for you, that's an art that you need to learn, that how I'm able to identify or ask questions which relate to the quality attributes. And in the analysis, you need to have that skill set where you can as you are going through the classifying the requirements, where you can say, okay, so under the quality attributes, if the user is talking about, say, performance or management of the requirements, so these are some of the metrics that can come under the quality attributes part, right? So I'll read the definition. It says that it's a process of classifying requirements information into various categories. You evaluate the requirements for desirable qualities, you represent requirements in different forms, and then derive the detailed requirements. That's really important, detailed requirements from high-level requirements. And then you negotiate priorities, another really important step in analysis and related activities. So yeah, just mainly, like, I mean, as it's talking about that you are now documenting the requirement and trying to gather as much information and meaning out from those requirements as possible. Key actions in analysis, like we discussed some key actions in elicitation, let's talk about key action in analysis phase. So the first one is analyzing the information received from users to distinguish their task goals from other requirements, right? So when you go through the real requirements gathering, you will realize that when you talk to your client, it's really worth listening to. One challenge is actually to get them to talk to you. And like I said previously as well, that's a piece of art, that how you're able to trigger a discussion to get that piece of information from them, right? You don't have to feel shy. It's something that you have to be really adept at in the elicitation phase. And so, I mean, as I said, they mainly what we have seen is that the clients talk a lot on the functionalities, but they may have no idea about the quality attributes, right? So it's your job as a business analyst to make sure that you bring in the quality attributes discussion as well. And hopefully in the workshops that we are going to have, these are some of the skills that you can practice with your client, and which is like, I mean, you know, like your TAs, and I will be acting as your client. So you will see that in the workshops after the holiday break, these are some of the things that we will bring up as well. How to make sure that the information that you are analyzing is covering all aspects, from your business, the big picture, to the functional, to the non-functional requirements, right? Okay, so that was the first step. The second one is decomposing the high-level requirements into an appropriate level of detail. So basically, analysis is what? It's basically trying to break the high-level needs to small chunks. So high-level need can be like a really vague requirement that is open to the reader's interpretation, right? And if something is vague, what happens? It leads to a gap between what the user had in mind and what the developer is going to ultimately build. So, for example, like if the requirement is that we need a search functionality. So I think it's really important that you decompose it into further smaller chunks, and you say, okay, so you're trying to, you can break it down into, so what sort of search parameters are they asking for? In what databases do they need that? How do they want the output to come out? So if we just lead the system to a high-level requirement, it will just lead to further confusion and misinterpretation at the part in the development part, and that will obviously lead to high cost and delay in the delivery of the system. So decomposing the requirements is a key action to the analysis, to that stage where it is easy for you to understand what is being asked for and to what depth. All right. Yeah, and the next stage is deriving the functional requirements. Obviously, that's our main target. That's where we are doing the analysis, that what functionalities is the client mainly asking for in his application. Then we talk about the quality attributes. Now, I want to emphasize here that quality attributes are very critical. right? They are as important as your functional attributes, your functional requirements. So your non-functional requirements or the quality attributes, why are they important? Because if not implemented, they can turn out to be quite costly with their implementation very late in the project, right? So the key focus should be that when you're trying to gather your information, in the elicitation sessions, try to get the feedback from your participants around quality attributes as well, right? We have to make them talk about the non-functional attributes as well, right? Because there are many papers as well where the software engineers have talked about, they have highlighted that how important it is, even number one, that it's not easy to differentiate from the beginning. You may not be able to differentiate in your analysis from the beginning, but then how important it is during your elicitation to insert those questions, to bring them, your users, again and again back to the topic of what non-functional requirements also are there, is their priority. So the next is allocating the requirements to software components which are defined in the software architecture. So sometimes you will realize that you have some components available for the software design that you're making, right? There are always some off-the-shelf systems existing that are there to meet your needs. So for example, like the authentication system or the login system, you may not need to implement it yourselves. Your developer team may not need to implement it because there are plenty of systems that are providing that really good quality authentication functionality. So what you have to do in the analysis is make sure that you're able to also see such existing systems that are available, number one, and also get engaged with your technical team, right? So, because they would be, so who is the technical team here? Who are the people who they would all like either be your software developers or your architects? And why it's important to engage with your technical team is because you need to seek their opinion as well on how you're going to implement the requirements, right? You have to discuss with them, take their opinion and expertise if those requirements are doable. Do they, as the technical team, have the expertise, the capability to, as a team, to develop those requirements, right? And then also bring into consideration while you're discussing what are the existing systems that are available to meet the client's needs. So all this comes under this allocating the requirement to the software components. So talking to your developers team as well, and bringing into discussion the existing components that can fulfill the role of the system functionalities. Okay. Now we move on to the next one. Of course, prioritizing. So negotiating implementation priorities. Now, I cannot emphasize more on developing this skill, right? This is like a key, one of the key actions of the analysis, where you are going to talk to your client and ask them that what are their priorities, which attributes are really important for your client, which functionalities are the ones that they really want first. So there's this model that we use to implement the priorities called the Moscow model. So there are some, the M here stands for must have. They are the ones that need to be the number one on the priority list. And then there are some which S stands for the should have priorities, and C stands for could have, that if you have them, that's fine. They can come in the later version of the application that you're making. And W at the end stands for, I think, would have, that even if you don't have them in the first release of your system, that's fine. So yeah, so mainly talking to your client about which functionalities they want first, which quality attributes are their priority, and that they want to be delivered in the system on the priority basis. So yeah, okay, now moving on. Identifying the gaps in the requirements or the unnecessary requirements. Now, it again refers to, to the clarifications that you can do in your requirement development framework, which is, it's again referring to that iterative process, right? You find any gaps while you're doing your analysis. If you identify anything that is vague, something that does not look important to you, something that is important but is missing, right? That is all part of the analysis activity. So, for example, now it uses the word gaps. So gaps can be anything. It's something that it refers both to the important requirements, and it also refers to the unnecessary ones, right? Which requirements just need to be dropped, right? Identifying gaps also refers to which requirements your client wants to be available in the first release of the system, and then what requirements you can leave for the next releases. And as you can see from the way I'm explaining this whole process, it's all iterative. You will be going back and forth, making things as clear as possible, what your clients want, what they are asking for. And at the end, our main goal is to make the requirements as clear as possible for the stakeholders. So, these are basically some of the key actions covered in the analysis part. And actually, this finishes our our session on analysis as well. But there's one more slide that I want to cover about the good practices on requirement analysis. Okay. So just going over the main things that we have talked about, that though our main goal is to derive the functional requirements, we are also talking about making the non-functional requirements as equally important as possible. And we are talking about clarifying the gaps, and we are talking about breaking any vague high-level requirement into appropriate level of details, so that it's easy for the developers to start developing and implementing and testing. And then we touched upon the software components that are actually available, talking to your developers team as well, if they have that capability to work on the software requirements that your user has asked for. So really making things as opening up, like the word analysis means, just to breaking everything down, making meaning of everything, how we have to do this, how clear is it for us and for our developers team. And for that, we are always open to go back to our users and seeking clarifications from them. Obviously, priorities are really important. We need to make sure based on our users' priorities, we are developing the system and then identifying the gaps. So I just inserted, there are 2 slides which refer to the specification. Now, this is something we are going to cover in our sessions after the holidays. And just a brief thing that analysis, basically, as it is clarifying things for us, anything that we have gathered from the users, we are trying to get clarifications, any ambiguities that we have, we are trying to remove them. And then the main idea behind that whole process is that we want the requirements written as clearly and as possible, and make them as understandable for our users and for our developers, right? Again, like elicitation, analysis, specification, these are all steps that we are doing back and forth, trying to close the gaps, trying to find out exactly what the client meant, what the user is wanting, and also trying to understand that do we have everything Like sometimes your developing team can also provide you with good feedback that something that they find is missing in the requirements. So specification is that phase where you will also get to know from your developing side, developers team, if they say that they have either they have all the requirements written clearly for everyone, for everybody to understand, or they need some more clarification. Right, so this diagram is again showing that we are doing everything in parallel. It's not that we have finished elicitation analysis and now we're just focusing on specification. We are doing everything in an iterative way. So just to end this session on the requirement analysis, this is something, it's always good to know about the good practices of any process, right? Now, if you notice that the slide is not titled best practices, because there is no such best practices in requirement development. These are why we call it as good practices, because they are based on the experiences of the software developers, of what they have learned over the years. And so yeah, you don't have to like follow them strictly, but then if you know about them and if you incorporate them in your analysis, you are heading for a better analysis of the requirement. And so I'll begin with the first one. So I mean, I always talk about good practices as they go hand in hand with common sense as well, right? If you rely on your common sense as well, then you can, like significantly improve how you handle your project's requirements. So the first one here talks about model the application environment, right? So basically it means that a really good way of modeling the environment is that you make an ecosystem map, right? So an ecosystem map, basically it provides you with a very good understanding of the client's business environment, right? And in that business environment, it's not just who that you are going to highlight on, it's also about the exchanges that are taking place between the clients and the groups with which they are interacting, right? So what the main business is, of course, you'll highlight that, who their vendors are, who are their users, and then like what are the transactions that they do with their vendors, right? When do these transactions happen, right? So for example, when and it basically talks, the ecosystem is going to, ecomap, sorry, is going to highlight the present functioning of your client, like how they're doing business right now. So for example, like when in the present system do they send an invoice to a customer, right? So that transaction that you're going to highlight in an eco map is going to inform you about that. And like where do the important events happen? How do these events happen? How do they inform or they get in touch with their vendors? Like, like sometimes does your client mainly uses like email, or do they have like a delivery driver, like depending on the nature of the business, of course, or do they use snail mail, right? So this, by using an eco map, you can very well understand the environment, number one, and number two, you can remove many false assumptions that you may have about your client's environment, right? And remember that anything that helps you avoid false assumptions is a good thing to practice. You must incorporate that in your analysis because it's going to avoid confusions later on. And later on, any confusion, the late that you go, in adopting any good practice, the costly it would be. So yeah, so this eco map is basically about understanding everything, like the business processes, what your clients' product lines are, who their competitors are, who their end customers are, who their middle customers are, right? What their technology, of course, their technology infrastructure is, how they are actually, what is the relation between all these all these, what do you call them? Like the who of your business, right? The vendors, the users, the customers, the competitors. So by making an eco map, you get a really clear picture of the environment. You define the boundaries, you define what are the external entities. So for example, if by doing this, what you're doing is you're getting really good information, useful information that is going to help you be informed on what technology they use, on what platform they use, what are their timelines, product delivery timeline, product manufacturing timeline, what are their priorities. And I think it's an absolute best way to understand the current business environment, right? That you start off collaborating on an ecosystem map. And then through that ecosystem map, you can see how the new system that they're asking for is going to fit into the environment, right? How it's going to affect the users, what hardware devices, what, of course, the functionalities they're asking for, how it's going to impact the present system that they are working in. So, and like on a recent project, what happened was that there was a separate company that was delivering the client their products. And the client hadn't realized that they also needed to share the data with them. And just imagine that such a big miss can have big miss early on in the elicitation phase is going to be worse as you go on in the specification and the development of the application. So eco maps are a really good way of making the having a good understanding for you and for your client as well about their existing business environment. All right. And then we talk about creating a user interface. So, when it's and technical prototypes. So I think a prototype is a really good way when you as a business analyst or a user, they're not certain about the requirements, because what a prototype does is it makes the concepts or the requirements more tangible, right? And prototypes sort of help the developers as well as the users to come to a mutual understanding of the problem. And that way they, when they have the same level of understanding, that is going to help your requirements get more validated, because that's what you're heading for. That's your main goal. So prototyping is a really good way in the analysis. And then we talk about requirements feasibility now and the risks. So feasibility is, it involves concepts like, is it okay to implement a requirement at an acceptable cost and at this performance? So your feasibility reports can have like a cost feasibility report and a performance feasibility report. So this is something that you can also work with your developers team because they can help you evaluate the feasibility of implementing each requirement. And they can tell you like if it's going to be done at the cost that was agreed upon with the client. And of course, it also helps to understand the risks that are associated with implementing each requirement, right? Risks can be like if there is any conflict coming with the other requirement, if there are any dependencies on the other requirements, right? If there is any dependency on an external factor, and that is something which is out of your hand, like any market conditions are changing. So how's that going to impact? If there are any technical obstacles, and it can be even that you realize that it's not, your team does not have that expertise to fulfill that, the requirement that your client has asked for. So requirements, that are technically infeasible, a good way is that they can be simplified. so that they are still contributing to your client's main business objective, right? And if they are like overly expensive, so how to break that down so that the cost remains under control. So yeah, so feasibility is another main aspect of good practice that you can involve in your analysis. And next is the prioritizing the requirements. So we have touched upon this before as well. It's very important that the team like implements the requirement that is of highest value, or that is the one that is needed functionality wise first, right? I touched upon, we are going to discuss this in our specification as well. So there's this model called the Moscow model, the must-have requirement. You can what those requirements are that must be implemented in the system. That S is that they should be there, like they are really important, but then they're not essential, right? And then C is for the could have, that they are nice to have requirements, but these requirements are like they have a small impact and you can just leave them out. And the W is that, yeah, won't have. So requirements that are not really important for this first release of the application or the system. So based on the priority, right, you determine that which like what features will the first release of that application contain, right? And yeah, so prioritizing the requirements, another good practice. Then we talk about creating a data dictionary. Now, for this to explain, let me take you to an example. So the example is, suppose that there's a ride-sharing company like Uber or like some other company, a ride-sharing company, and basically what they have to do is, now they are having some difficulty in their sharing of the data within the company itself, right? So they have this metrics that they measure, which is the number of rides a week, right? Now, when the business analyst came and they had a meeting and they are defining this metrics, so for the business analyst, it was very difficult to identify what this metrics mean, right? Because what he saw was, what the team saw is that the marketing team was defining the number of rides per week as the number of rides that were started between, say, January 1st till January 7th, for example, right? So marketing team defined it as the number of rides that have started. The data team of that company, they defined the number of rides per week as the rides that were completed between the January 1st and January 7th. And so one is using the word, their definition is different from the marketing team. And the sales team is defining these rides, the number of rides per week, as the total number of riders that paid for the ride between January 1st and January 7th, for example. So you can see why we are now talking about creating a consistent data dictionary, right? And any good organization which actually will have a consistent data dictionary. So what is that? Like the term dictionary itself defines that it's a list of key terms and metrics with definitions. So it's like a business glossary, right? And even though it seems quite simple, but when you're talking about aligning the definitions between the different business departments, it can become quite difficult, right? So, and any organization which is like all these data-driven organizations, which basically depend on this data and function on the data that are, for example, I've just described for this ride-sharing company, how important and critical this element becomes, right? because, I mean, it can lead to really big problems, and not just within the company, but also when the business analyst comes to elicit all the requirements. So this confusion needs to be resolved, right? So what can we do in order to bring more consistency in the data dictionary? So the first step that you can do is that, like within the business, different departments, you can collect different terms that all these departments are using, right? And then you can have a look at the business definitions that they have for these for these terms. And then, of course, you take a look at the sample of them. Another really good thing that I read was that you can make use of the reports that are generated by the company, or you can read their manuals and also collect the terms that are used there. And that can also give you a very good understanding of the main metrics that are used across departments. Because remember that the client may not be available to come to talk to you on these terms, as they may not see this as important. But you can always make use of the existing resources that they have available. And then on your part, like you can, you can write the names of all the terms and make sure that they are unabbreviated, right? So making things as clear as possible to what extent that you can go to. And even make it so easy that even if these are technical terms, the non-technical staff can also understand these definitions, right? And so you can prepare an initial draft where you say, okay, this is what I've collected, and these are the definitions that I've collected, and make them as easy as possible. And then you can probably, schedule a time to sit with them and ask them if there are any inconsistencies or if there are any inaccuracies or anything needs to be refined. All right. So all of this is, it really brings efficiency on, as you will see in your requirement specification as well, which is where you'll be talking so much on the documentation of the requirements. And if you are able to work on removing these ambiguities early on, that can obviously lead to good results for you and your team. So, right. Now we move on to, so once you have like a draft, initial draft ready, and you have a meeting with them, so then probably you can, if they agree on it, then you can get that signed off. And what else is there? And then, you make sure that if there are any changes in the data dictionary, then you can communicate those changes to the rest of the team and make sure that all of the teams are sort of informed about the new changes. And a really good way for that, to inform them of any changes in a way like to upkeep the data dictionary, would be to open a Slack channel, right? And there, on that channel, all the business stakeholders are there, and they can stay informed on the changes taking place, as well as on the key goal, that is on what the key business definitions are. So I'm just describing them in detail so that, you can always, I mean, I know it's a lot of theory, but then when you go into the real world, it's a good idea that you read about and keep them in your mind as you're conducting your analysis phase, because hopefully it's going to help you become a better analyst and save you time from any problems ahead. Now, the next one is modeling the requirements using diagrams. So, I mean, anything that is represented visually, of course, has a much more benefit than something that is a textual representation, right? So if you have a huge list of functional requirements and they're just presented to you in as a text, rather you have something that is available to you as a flow diagram or an entity relationship diagram. So just imagine how much difference that can make in your understanding as well as your client's understanding of what has been collected as requirement. So modeling can remove, they can reveal a lot of inconsistencies, anything that is missing, anything that is incorrect, right? Obviously, and even superfluous requirements, things that are really not needed, that are just there for, yeah, we can have them, but then by using a diagram, they can also help you identify that these are not essential, these are not my must-haves. So it's a win-win for both the parties, for the users as well as for your software developing side. So make use of modeling as much as possible. And we discussed that even in our elicitation phase, that once we have a visual ready, that generates a lot of discussion and a lot of participation from the client as well. Analyzing the interface between your system and the outside world. So yeah, so basically, sometimes you would, you would like to see what systems that are existing there off the shelf that you would like to incorporate in your application that you're making. So that means that any embedded systems involve like a lot of interconnection between the software and hardware components, right? So this is something you will look into as you are trying to embed any existing system in the new system that you're making. And the entire goal of this is that you're trying to make sure that the application that you're making is fitting in smoothly. It's going to be a good fit into the environment, into the client's environment, right? So yeah, any information system that you are going to use, just make sure that they are embedded properly. So so even if it's like a network connected application, they have communication interfaces. So you make sure that they are embedded, they're going to be embedded properly in your system. Next is allocating requirements to subsystems. So for example, here I'll take, like, you are building an access system to make a building secure, like for its security, right? So what subsystems you can think of? So like the main product is that you need to make this secure access system, but then there can be many subsystems that you can think of. Would anyone like to say anything? All right. So, so for example, like security at a place can be through video cameras. It can be through door locks, recorders, and even human guards, right? And obviously, we can incorporate that magnetic or that optical badges. So these subsystems, I just want to tell you, they can incorporate both the software, the hardware, and the human subsystems as well, right? So in your analysis, you can even do, you can allocate your requirements to these subsystems as well. And that helps you break down the requirements into smaller chunks. Again, it's a lead to making your analysis as clear and as unambiguous as possible. So this, this slide mainly finishes here, and some further reading for those who are interested on analysis. So tomorrow, Tuesday, I just want to tell you that, yeah, we are going to have a workshop, and we're also having a paper presentation, and we are going to just have this initial client meeting. And after the holidays, we are going to work. I'm going to take up the specification in my seminar, and in your workshops, you will talk about like the elicitation part and do the analysis as well. So we are trying to make things easy for you, like for the project course. But this discussion that I'm doing in the seminars is a good opening into the real world scenarios, that what actually happens. So there would be risks involved in every stage. Nothing would go on smooth as well. But then with practice, and if you're new, like for a new software developer, if you're and a new business analyst, if you are able to incorporate and take care of those good practices that we talk about at each stage, that's going to help you a lot in becoming a good business analyst, I hope. So yeah, that's all from my side for today, and I'm going to end the show for now.